Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. As has been announced, what I'd like to speak to you about today is the shifting global economy, the rise of the East, the great shift east. These are economic issues, and at this point, it might seem to us relatively abstract and general. Certainly, what I'm going to talk about here will not get to touch as many of you as the previous talk on toilet paper. But the global economy and its shift is something that has affected all of us. At some level, we've all read about or heard about how the rise of the East, where most of the world's poor still live, has removed over 627, has lifted 627 million people out of extreme poverty. What could be the global tension in that? What could anyone object to about that? Other things that we know about the Great Shift East. Every one of you has seen the iPads that have populated our presenters who have come up on stage. They've all been reading off you. From the audience, you can, if you look carefully, look at the back of the iPad, and you will see that every single one of these iPads, every single one of the iPhones that we carry, has been lovingly designed in California, but manufactured in Shenzhen, China. And the rise of the East has brought us affordable, personalized, emerging technology. Again, what could be bad about that? Over the last few months, those of us who've lived here in the Eurozone, who live in Europe, have witnessed the spectacle of our political leaders looking east for financial resources to reform our ailing banking system. And we've looked east for rescue from the sovereign debt crisis. But at the same time that all of this is happening, there is a darker undercurrent, an undercurrent that's not so positive. Okay. There are people, for instance, who will with perfect honesty and complete integrity, speak to us about how if the rising East continues the way that they have, and they start to consume at the same levels of consumption that those of us in the West enjoy, if, for instance, every person in China ate the same amount of seafood as we all get to enjoy in Western Europe, the oceans would be denuded of fish. We would have no fish left. The rise of the East brings with it the dangers and risks as well. And there are observers who look around how the world is today and say that, this 2008 global financial crisis that we've just lived through, yes, part of it has to do with evil, greedy bankers. Part of it has to do with irresponsible behavior by us. But a lot of that is driven by what we see as global imbalances. The fact that the East has built huge productive capacity, does not yet have the domestic consumption capacity to keep up with that. And therefore, they sell us in the West cheap goods that we buy. This has allowed them to build up their holdings of our debt, and it has encouraged a flow of cheap capital into Western financial markets that encouraged and brought about the 2008 global financial crisis. In fact, there are some people who say that since 9/11, 2001, 10 years ago, the three most frightening words in the United States are not war on terror, but made in China. That is the world that we live in, a world pregnant with dangers as well as possibilities. So, what I want to do in the time that I've got is address two questions. Will the rise of the East continue to bring hundreds of millions of people out of extreme poverty? Will it succeed? Will it count for humanity? And will it do that before the East slows down? Because there are many observers who look around the world, look at the consumption that's going on, look at the global financial crisis, look at the dangers of trade wars, and suggest that all of this might not continue. Underlying this is the idea that somehow the state of the world, directly or indirectly, the dangers that we're in, the risky economic position we find ourselves, can be traced back to the rise of the East. And so, has the East now gotten large enough to affect the rest of us, but has the East not yet become mature enough to take the responsibility for running a world economy sensibly? Those are the two questions I want to address, and I want to get through them by beginning from where the world looked before we began this great shift east. The world had to be somewhere before it started to shift east. And this is the way the world looked. Not just today, but not that long ago. And as you cast your eye around this, you will recognize, I hope, as many of you will have come from different parts of the world, I hope your eye goes to that part of the world and you realize this is what traditional thinking along the transatlantic axis, the powers, traditional global economic powers, thinks of where we come from. Okay, in this world, the world is changing. This world is not one where any longer Americans consider themselves to be the center, in the sense that they don't consider the transatlantic axis now to be the center. Recently, when Transatlantic Trends carried out its survey, and it asked Americans, where do you think the most important region of the world is for the future of your country? It asked people all around the world this. Young Americans, the next Steve Jobs, the people who are going to transform the world of technology, entertainment, and design, the people who are going to be speaking up at TED conferences in the future. Young Americans, over 70% of them, consider Asia be where the destiny lies in the future, some engagement with Asia. And that's for the good. This is forward-looking. The future of the world now looks to where things that are happening out east, the exciting, interesting things that are improving the welfare of humanity by lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. The world is paying attention to that. The old world, where we live, Europeans have been paying much less attention to this. Okay. But not all of this attention is necessarily good attention. Here is a slide from an interview that CNN carried out with a friend of mine, Kishore Mahbubani, who's a strong argument, who provides strong arguments for how the rise of the East is a good thing. But nonetheless, the way CNN reports this is, wake up, America, you're falling behind. So that when Transatlantic Trends goes and asks the question, do you consider the rise of Asia, the rise of China, a threat or an opportunity? Double the number of Americans say that they consider the rise of China a threat, not an opportunity. Thankfully, the Europeans who don't much care about the rise of the East for now view the rise of China in a little bit more friendly terms. So, again, my question. This is the world that we've begun our discussion with. This is the world that's changing. We want to know how it's changing. Now, I have cartoonist friends who might be able to produce pictures like this at a snapshot at a point in time. As an economist, I can't just rely on the goodwill of my cartoonist friends to tell me how the world is changing. I'm going to go look at data. And here's how we can look at data. This is one caricature of the world. This is another one. This is a picture of our planet taken by NASA satellites encircling the Earth, taking photographs of our planet at night. The reason for doing that is taking up the picture of our planet at night shows up the nighttime sky. Showing up the nighttime sky tells us where people live, and where people live at this scale is also where they work, where they create value. And as you can see in this picture, NASA confirms that cartoonist view of the world. The most striking part of this picture, the swath of lights in North America and the swath of lights in Western Europe. And although it might not refer to Australia as kangaroos, the same way that the cartoonist did, Australia barely figures in this map of the world, a map of the world that shows the global economic activity. But here's the problem. This is a picture that NASA took 30 years ago. This is a picture of the world 30 years ago. How has the world changed? NASA no longer takes photographs like this, so I did the next best thing. I asked Google Earth to tell me where economic activity is based now on Earth. And here's what Google Earth told me. It says, I can find 700 places on Earth where you can measure economic activity. Go ahead and plot them. Plot the 700 points on Earth, and you see this cloud of economic activity on our planet. Now, to summarize what's happening there, you can calculate the center of gravity, of the swath of lights that represents economic activity. And 30 years ago, when you looked at the planet, the center of gravity was the black dot that you see in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, right smack dab on the transatlantic axis, right between Western Europe and the United States, exactly as NASA's photograph told us it would be. But the world has changed. And how has it changed? This is how. This animation shows at 3-year intervals what Google Earth was able to tell me about the changing location of economic activity on Earth. The sequence of black dots every 3 years shows an eastwards movement from west of London, west of the Mediterranean Ocean, in the last 3 decades, tracking 5,000 kilometers eastwards, so that by the end of last year, the last black dot that's charted is now east of Izmir, Turkey. It's east of Helsinki. It is east of the Mediterranean Ocean. And if in a whimsical way, you ask, go on Google Earth, show me what the world's going to look like in the next 30 years, Google will answer any question you ask it. And this is what it says, after some manipulation. What it shows is that the world's center of gravity continues on this path. It continues another 5,000 kilometers, so that very soon, within our lifetimes, the world's economic center will be based on the boundary between India and China. And the question that raises for us, if we keep in mind what happened with that earlier cartoon that I showed you, is this. How do we engage in global policy making based on the transatlantic axis view of the world when the world's economic center will soon be 10 time zones east of Washington, D.C.? What is the right way to engage in economic policy when the world changes in this way? Now, there will be some of you who will rightly say, well, what you did was a little bit whimsical. Aren't there problems along the way? This, however, I submit, is the $64 trillion question that's going to determine how our planet's governance proceeds. We've got to have a system of sensible, rational way of thinking about how our global economy is going to evolve. Some of you will say, well, this projection is just too extreme to believe. Well, first, what's happened in the world's economic center of gravity, this 5,000 kilometer drift, that's already history. There's nothing we can do about that. It's already happened. The world's economic center is now east of us as we sit here in London, whereas 3 decades ago, it was still west of us, pulled towards New York City. Isn't China in desperate economic trouble? Well, doesn't China have overbuilt housing? Is China or the rest of East Asia really? Has it overbuilt on consumption? Has it overbuilt housing so that too many, we read stories about how China has 67 million units of housing. They are unoccupied. They are entire ghost towns that China, in its rush for economic development and throughout the rest of East Asia, have overbuilt, and there will not be enough people to live in them. China does not have enough, China or the rest of East Asia, because of this thing called Asian thrift, will not generate enough domestic consumption to sop up what they are producing. And so we in the West will still be forced to purchase their goods and services. And if I could do an old person's curmudgeonly voice, I would say we've seen all this before. We've heard these stories about how the rise of the East will redraw the world. We saw this with Japan, and won't this just be Japan all over again? Now, very quickly, I'm going to say, actually, Asians are very capable of generating consumption. This is a photograph from London's Oxford Street, just a couple of months ago. Day after Christmas, who should be the first in line for sales in shopping but, good gosh, the mainland Chinese? Some of them are Chinese students here at the LSE, but every single one of them spent 3 to 7 times more than the average other person in any of these stores. Asian consumption will pick up. And the reason it will pick up is because when Asia becomes rich, its consumption will rise. The reason that Asia saves so much now is because it is so poor. Now, we could run through these reasonings, which I won't do now in the interest of time, but suggest that Asia, at the same time that it's building up its productive capacity, is also generating other tokens of a society, soft power, fashion, arts, creativity, all of which we ought to be welcoming into our global community. But if we continue to have the view that the rise of the East is endangering the world economy and we need to push back, we will not allow our global economy to transition to where it ought to go, which is prosperity for all of us. So let me get to where I now answer the question. Will the East slow before it counts? Is the East now only large enough to perturb the rest of the world, but not mature enough to shoulder the responsibility? And my answers to these questions, based on the evidence I've shown you, is that for the first of them, the answer is gloriously no. The East has a lot of potential capacity still on the upside. And the answer to the second is that is an epic fail. It is the wrong question. The question is, how do we, as a global society, generate the kind of global public goods that will allow our global economy to all grow together in an environmentally sensible and balanced way? Thank you very much.